We're here with Dr. Bob Musil, President and CEO of the Rachel Carson Council. Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, in 1962. What was the significance of that book?
Oh, wow. There were many significances, but I think people should understand that Silent Spring, which is known primarily for Rachel's incredible expose of the widespread use of DDT, a toxic chemical, around the country, was actually a bestseller, and Rachel had had three different bestsellers before that. So it was the talk of the town. It was all over the place, and she was a beloved author. So it had impact and significance because she was a best-selling author. But it came out at a time where in the United States, there were just chemicals being sprayed all over the place to kill mosquitoes, fire ants, gypsy moths. The rivers were burning in Ohio. It was really pretty dreadful pollution going on. And when this book came out, it touched people in a way across the country that just lit a flame under the environment movement. And probably as importantly, it influenced the administration of John F. Kennedy, who at a raucous press conference, they're saying, Mr. President, we're hearing a lot about pesticides. And are you going to be doing anything about that? And he said, yes, you must be talking about Miss Carson's book, Silent Spring. We're going to be forming a task force about that. That task force went through, validated all of the science, all of the assertions and claims in Silent Spring, and began a process of undoing DDT and other chemicals that ultimately led to a whole series of things like saving the birds and the animals and so on. So that there's two big things, I say. Worldwide recognition and setting off an environmental movement where people read this and just went, I got to do something about it. I got to be involved. And the president himself setting up a series of reforms that led to all that we now think of as environmental legislation of the 1960s and 70s.
Now, how did Rachel first learn about the health effects of pesticides?
Whoa. Well, that's sort of an interesting story, but people, don't realize that Rachel Carson was a government bureaucrat that, like the scientists today in the government, those who are still there, she worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and was an editor, marine biologist. She reviewed, edited, and dealt with every important piece of scientific research and articles and so on that came out. And therefore, she was also friends with a guy doing all that research who happened to be a leading ornithologist and birder named Chan Robbins, whose Field Guide to the Birds was a major bestseller. So he's up at Patuxent Research Center in Maryland, where they're doing this research on the long-term effects. So Rachel visits, goes birding with him, knows him, learns all about it. This is in 1945, not 1962 when Silent Spring came out. And she tried to write an article about it. She did. And she submitted it to Reader's Digest, the biggest, best known popular magazine in every home at the time. And in 1946, they said to Rachel Carson, sorry, no thanks. It's too boring. We're not going to. And so that's how she learned. But unfortunately for us, we didn't learn widely and take action about these dangers until until Silent Spring came out in 1962. So that's how she knew. That's basically how she learned all sorts of things, because she was connected with every important government scientist, every leading environmental scientist, and gathered that information and had the ability to write about it in ways that were compelling and would draw in readers and audiences as if she were an influencer.
You talked about how the general public and the president both felt like they needed to act about stopping these pesticides after the release of this book. How did the pesticide companies feel about the release of Silent Spring?
Well, they were concerned. That is, they tried to prevent the publication of the book. They threatened lawsuits. They're also involved in hiring paid scientific quacks, I would say, guys in white coats who literally were doctors and so on, like the type who went on TV then and told you that cigarettes were smooth and good for you. And they went around not only attacking the science of the book, but Rachel directly with ad hominem or ad femininem attacks on uh, on her womanhood, that she was a spinster, which was sort of code in those days for not very womanly. And one guy in a white coat on TV with big dark glasses says, "How can a woman without children tell us about the future?" That was pretty much the reaction. But fortunately, Carson had planned for these attacks and had worked with high-level scientists and folks who wanted to see this word get out with a plan, in effect, a strategy of how to make this book popular and how to resist these attacks from all over the place. And so she connected up with influential people in Washington, powerful women like Eleanor Roosevelt, Jackie Kennedy, Frances Perkins, who'd been the Secretary of Labor under FDR, wealthy women, the publisher of the Washington Post, gathered in luncheons, plotted along with her publicist on how to turn this into a bestseller and be ready for these attacks. And they were vicious.
Prior to the release of this book, what did environmental protection look like in the United States at the time?
Ah, well, it was there. I should say, when we say Rachel came along with Silent Spring and ignited the modern environmental movement and expanded it, what we mean is that it was basically called conservation rather than environmentalism, etc. So that had been going on at least since the days of Teddy Roosevelt, who also belonged to the local Audubon Society, watched birds from the White House, and invited in scientists, activists from Audubon, showed the first films of birds in the White House, ultimately passed the Migratory Bird Act of 1918, which was the first big legislation to protect widespread destruction of species, in this case, millions of birds, mostly in Florida, but elsewhere, egrets, herons, plumed birds that were shot by guys in little boats with Gatling guns, and they were all used to decorate women's hats with beautiful feathers, sometimes the entire bird. And so women organized and by the millions and were the ones who created a movement and an outcry that led to Teddy Roosevelt, that led to these early conservation efforts. There also were all the moves to create national parks to protect forests and the like. Uh, but I think it's fair to say that most of what we had before Silent Spring was in the world of conservation, understanding the mountains, the wilderness, the bunnies, the trees. What changed with Silent Spring and Carson was that she wrote about eloquently and explained that we were all part of nature, that all of those chemicals went into the water, went into the food, the air, they came into us, they circled through the whole ecosystems. And so whether you were a bird, a fish, or a mosquito, or a human being, it would affect you. And so the connection between toxic chemicals, not just harming bugs or animals, and us was what really created this powerful connection between those, what had been two wings. So that's why we call it the sort of the modern environmental movement.
Before we get too far, let's talk about how Rachel Carson got to this part of her career. She was born on May 27th, 1907 in Springdale, Pennsylvania. How did her childhood and upbringing in the suburbs of Pittsburgh affect her interest in nature?
Whoa, well, we have to picture outside Pittsburgh as looking somewhat different than it does now. She was born on a small farm without running water, and basically, uh, she wandered around there, and with her mother, who was a brilliant, highly educated woman, who had a deep interest in nature and sharing that with kids, in this case, Rachel, her favorite, brightest daughter. Uh, and so she would wander around and with her mom and then alone, looking at the birds and all of that stuff. And she was alone pretty much and somewhat introverted her whole life, or diffident, or shy, whatever. So she often would talk about how animals are my friends and would write little stories about them that her mother encouraged. And fairly quickly, she got Rachel to submit essays to the best known, widely read children's magazine of the time called St. Nicholas Magazine that published stories by Robert Louis Stevenson and Herman Melville and later other well-known authors like Rachel. But she was winning literary prizes at age 11, silver medal for that, etc. Um, and so she started both this sense of awe and wonder for nature and everything in it, and careful observation and loving it, and then writing about it at a very early age. She also, being an imaginative child, one of the things that touched her, and it's amazing, she was walking in the Rocky Hills around there and came upon the fossil of a fish. And she looks and says, look at that. How in the world could a fish have been floating around near Springdale, leading her to a fascination with what must have been a sea, what must have been a totally different landscape environment. And so it began her interest in the sea and in evolution and other creatures at a very, very early age. So she went to local school. She was always the top student, always a little lonely. People thought she was maybe a little aloof until they got to know her because she had a wicked sense of humor and played field hockey and stuff like that. Uh, but I think uh, she to move along, not too far away, after high school, where she was the valedictorian, of course, uh, and she went off to Chatham College in Pittsburgh, then known as the Pennsylvania College for Women. It was the best church-related women's college you could get, which her mother made sure that she would go to a place like this and also visit it every weekend. So Rachel did not have a social life, or she would come home on the train, her mother would come over. But it is there that uh, first with a female mentor, friend, and exciting English teacher named Grace Croft. And there are pictures of Rachel sitting on the bench with Rachel. College students, I don't think, get to do that these days with their English professors. I'm not sure. And she won prizes again in writing and so on. But she came under the influence, the thrall, if you will, of a charismatic young science biology professor named Mary Scott Skinker, who was glamorous and wore cool clothes and all that kind of stuff, and was a brilliant teacher and scientist. And so she had a heavy influence on Rachel, who got more and more interested, learned what she was doing. Mary Skinker, up at Woods Hole and the kinds of trips and research. And so She changed her major and decided that, she could write. She knew how to write. She'd been winning prizes. What do you write about? And she talks about having finally found something to write about. And that was the sea, the ocean, the critters in it. She went up to Woods Hole, saw her first sea life when they dredged up starfish and other stuff. She wept when she first saw mullets jumping up out of the water and how incredible it was with these creatures. And that is what led to three best-selling books and then ultimately to Silent Spring. So it's a journey that leaves Pennsylvania, but she also comes back there. I mean, I think it's interesting or fun for people to know. I lived in Pennsylvania quite a while. I'm a birder. That's what we call it, bird watchers. So we understand it's not just some silly little thing. And would go bird watching, look basically up Hawk Mountain, excuse me, in Pennsylvania. And Rachel did the same thing. Went up there from Washington, and she just has a few little unpublished essays about her trip there. Evidently, she didn't see much in the way of hawks or wasn't all that impressed. I mean, I've been there, and unless you're a master birder, these little brown specks come flying over, and the rangers say, Sharpie on 5. But there is Rachel atop this mountain and writing and thinking about how there is an ocean of air above her and an ocean below her, in that the limestone rocks on which she is sitting and looking at the hawks are the product of eons of evolution, of creating this limestone out of foraminifera, little things in the ocean that have calcium and begin to form rocks. It is such an amazing imaginative scientific journey that reveals why Rachel Carson found every creature, every person as a unique, important uh, individual, whether a person or a species. And that she wrote about, just for examples, in her very first book, Under the Sea Wind, about uh, a sandpiper called Sanderling, and one of the heroes of the book is Blackfoot, the sandpiper, and she is aware that when you watch a Sanderling, and many people on the East Coast by the shores have done that, they're the little mechanical-looking ones that zip in and out just the edge of the shore, getting clams and so on, black feet, black nose. No other creature on Earth has evolved, has been created, can live in that ecosystem, and has the ability to zip in and out and eat little crabs, and then migrate to the Arctic to reproduce, and then go down to Central America in an incredible 12,000-mile journey. That is the kind of thing that Rachel Carson is thinking about, whether she's in Pennsylvania, Hawk Mountain, along the Atlantic coast, where she did much of her work for her ocean books. And then she turned that ability, that feeling, that power into Silent Spring, which otherwise would have been a pretty boring screed on pesticides and chemicals.
Was there a stigma at the time against women in science? Was that something that was common for the time?
I'm not sure we have enough time to cover the stigmas against women. Immense. And Rachel ended up a bureaucrat, a federal bureaucrat, a scientist, I really should say, but she's working in the government. People are surprised to know that. Mary Skinker, her mentor and friend, brilliantly educated, could not get a job, and ended up working in the federal government precisely for that reason. And when Rachel finished her dissertation with great, I was working on her dissertation and her graduate work at Hopkins. She was supporting her family, her mother, ne'er-do-well parts of the family, and her scholarship wasn't enough to pay for it all. She had to stop. She couldn't afford it. But then uh, she knew in the Depression, but still there was not a market for women scientists, women professors. I mean, it's not that there weren't a couple here and there, and in small women's colleges, not the big fancy men's colleges. Uh, so she talked with Mary Skinker, who said, "You should talk to the federal government, and I'll introduce you to Elmer Higgins, who helped me." And so she knocks on the door, meets Elmer. Uh, he hires her, sends her down to North Carolina to write a report on the work the Bureau of Fisheries was doing down there. She comes back with this thing, hands it to him. He looks at it and says, "Oh, Rachel, this will never do." Got a little twinkle in his eye. She's like, "Oh, really?" And he says, "Yes, it's too good. This is literature. You need to send it to the Atlantic Monthly in New York, and I'll get you a contact there." After fiddling over a while, she did, got a book contract, and launched this career. Uh, but she first started writing, she used the name R.L. Carson, not Rachel Louise Carson, Rachel Carson. She didn't want people to know it was a woman. And sometimes when people met her that hadn't seen her, "Oh, well, I didn't know that you were a nice little lady with red hair." I was just, yeah, there were a lot of stigmas. But it was the basics, and worse than now, where there still continues. I mean, the glass ceiling has been broken here and there, but it's not gone.
When and how did Rachel Carson die?
Oh, well, she died here in Washington, or in Silver Spring, Maryland, Washington area, of metastatic breast cancer. Uh, and it's not only sad and tragic that she suffered so much while she was trying to write Silent Spring, but that she was lied to her doctors. We were just talking about stigmas with women. Oncologists, cancer surgeons in those days did not believe that women should know or understand what's happening to them. It was beneath their pay grade, whatever that is. And so they discovered a malignant tumor and didn't tell her that it was spreading, and just said things will be fine. And it's just so outrageous and such malpractice, and that it's hard to believe. But that was the sense they had of women. They couldn't understand. It would just make things worse if they knew they really, that the cancer had spread. So they just didn't tell them. And so that's how she died. And while she was dying, writing Silent Spring and caring for her grandnephew who had been orphaned, and Rachel ends up, in her 50s, not only with cancer, writing Silent Spring, and trying to care for a rambunctious little boy. But as she was dying, and she knew she said to her friends and colleagues, she said, "I want you to start a group, an organization to carry on my work." And that is the Rachel Carson Council that still exists. I am not Rachel Carson, but I sort of follow in her flats and high heels. And her very close friend, colleague, pal, crony back at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a woman named Shirley Briggs, is the one who actually took the iconic picture of Rachel Carson atop Hawk Mountain, where she's looking with binoculars over the ridge for hawks. But it also shows clearly a woman with vision, looking to the future. And as I say to young people when I'm talking to them, she was looking for a new generation, for waves of people to carry on her work. And you are they.
Dr. Bob Musil, President and CEO of the Rachel Carson Council, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ellen.